For decades, the United States positioned itself as the global guardian of democracy. But behind closed doors, in shadowy rooms and distant capitals, another story was being written. A story of interventions, coups, propaganda. From Guatemala to Chile, from Argentina to Nicaragua. Regimes were toppled, leaders disappeared, and chaos followed. And in the name of freedom, death squads were armed, juntas were funded, and economies were dismantled. This is not fiction. This is history. Their history. And ours. You're watching Shadow of Empires. And this is how the United States sabotaged South America. In 1954, a covert operation orchestrated by the United States changed the course of a nation. This is the story of Guatemala's CIA coup known as Operation Coups. Post-World War II, Guatemala was a nation fractured by inequality. President Jacobo Arbenz, elected in 1951, set out to reform the system. His most controversial move, land redistribution, aimed at giving impoverished farmers a path to dignity. But these lands weren't just fallow fields. Much of them were controlled by the United Fruit Company, an American corporate giant with deep ties to Washington. What Arbenz saw as justice, the U.S. saw as a threat. In the early Cold War years, ideology shaped everything. The Eisenhower administration viewed any left-leaning reform in Latin America as potential Soviet infiltration. The Dulles brothers, John at the State Department and Alan at the CIA, had both personal and political interests in stopping Arbenz. Together, they built a plan one not of armies, but of shadows. The CIA launched Operation Coups in 1954, a full-scale covert operation to collapse the Guatemalan government from within. They funded and trained rebels, they launched propaganda over the airwaves, fake radio stations, psychological warfare, forged documents. They spread fear, rumors, and doubt. The goal wasn't to win a war. The goal was to make Arbenz believe he had already lost. In June 1954, the plan went live. Carlos Castilla Armas, a right-wing military officer, led a CIA-backed invasion from neighboring Honduras. Guatemala City was bombed, opposition forces were armed, and the government, surrounded and isolated, began to fracture. On June 27, 1954, Arbenz resigned. Not to a foreign army, but to the weight of silence, fear, and betrayal. Castilla Armas reversed the reforms, he banned political opposition, and Guatemala fell under the grip of authoritarian rule. The United States called it a victory, but the cost was long and bloody. A brutal civil war followed, lasting until 1996. Over 200,000 people were killed. Most of them, indigenous civilians, many of them, labeled communists and executed. Today, Guatemala still bears the scars. The events of 1954 weren't just a coup. They were the first domino in decades of bloodshed, repression, and foreign control. To understand modern Guatemala, you must understand the day its democracy was traded for bananas and silence. September 11, 1973, a date burned into the memory of Chile. On that morning, the skies over Santiago filled with smoke, and the flame of one of Latin America's few working democracies was extinguished. But how did it come to this? To understand the coup that ended the life of Salvador Allende, we must first understand what he stood for and who feared him most. In 1970, Salvador Allende, a physician and longtime socialist, was elected president of Chile, the first Marxist leader in the world to gain power through the ballot box. He called it the Chilean way to socialism. He nationalized copper mines, took control of banks and key industries, and redistributed land to the rural poor. To his supporters, Allende was a man of the people. To his enemies, he was a warning of what Latin America could become. Inside Chile, elites and business leaders were alarmed. Outside, the United States panicked. President Richard Nixon, advised by Henry Kissinger, authorized covert operations to undermine Allain's government. Money flowed to opposition parties, U.S. advisors encouraged economic sabotage. The CIA even plotted earlier coup attempts unsuccessfully. The American message was clear: make the Chilean economy scream. By 1973, it was screaming. Inflation was out of control. Basic goods disappeared from store shelves. Strikes paralyzed cities. Tensions split Chilean society in two. For many Chileans, daily life became unbearable. Support for Allende began to crumble not because of ideology, but because of hunger. What had begun as a revolution of hope now felt like chaos. On September 11, 1973, Chile's military moved. Led by General Augusto Pinochet, tanks rolled through Santiago, jets screamed overhead. They bombed La Moneda, the presidential palace, an unprecedented act of violence against a sitting leader. Inside, Allende refused to surrender. He gave a final radio speech, defiant to the end. "I will not resign," he declared. Moments later, he took his own life. Chile's democracy died with him. What followed was not peace. It was terror. Pinochet's regime rounded up thousands. People were imprisoned, tortured, killed, many never seen again. Chile became part of Operation Condor, a network of U.S.-backed military regimes that hunted political dissidents across South America. Yet even in darkness, the people resisted. They marched, they mourned, and they remembered. In 1988, after 15 years of repression, a national plebiscite ended Pinochet's rule. The dictatorship fell not with a bullet, but with a ballot. Today, Chile is a democracy once more, but the past is never truly gone. The fall of Salvador Allende was more than the end of a presidency. It was a warning that democracy, no matter how strong, can be undone from within and from beyond its borders. Two of South America's largest nations, Argentina and Brazil, fell into the grip of military juntas. How did that happen, and how did foreign powers help make it possible? Let's begin with Brazil. In 1964, President João Goulart, a moderate leftist, was overthrown in a military coup. The generals moved quickly, imposing censorship, abolishing civil liberties, and silencing dissent. The United States applauded. Washington feared another Cuba. Brazil's coup was framed as a course correction, a defense against communism. In reality, it was the birth of a 21-year dictatorship. Across the continent, the message was clear: if you are a leftist, you are a threat. And if you are a threat, you will be dealt with. 12 years later, in Argentina, history repeated itself. In 1976, the military seized power, launching what would become one of the bloodiest crackdowns in Latin American history. It was called the Dirty War, but it wasn't a war. It was a mass purge of political dissidents, students, labor organizers, and anyone deemed subversive. Over 30,000 people disappeared. Their names were never recorded. Their bodies were never found. Their families still search. Behind both regimes stood the shadow of the United States. Driven by Cold War paranoia, the U.S. launched Operation Condor, a secret coordination network of Latin American dictatorships supported with money, training, intelligence, and weapons. Political dissidents were tracked, arrested, tortured, or assassinated, often across borders. Washington's logic was cold and simple: repression was acceptable as long as communism was prevented. Today, declassified CIA and State Department documents confirm it. The U.S. knew, and it chose to look away. The juntas may have fallen, but their legacy is still alive. In Argentina, many former regime officials have stood trial. Survivors have shared their stories. Memorials and museums preserve the memory of the missing. Justice has been slow, but it has begun. In Brazil, the story is more complicated. The dictatorship ended in 1985, but accountability was avoided. No generals were prosecuted. No official truth commission delivered closure. Worse, in recent years, military rhetoric has returned to public life. Far-right politicians have praised the dictatorship, and the wounds of the past remain open, raw, and political. The stories of Argentina and Brazil remind us that democracy is fragile. It doesn't die overnight. It dies slowly through fear, silence, and complicity. What begins as national security can end in mass graves and erased names, and behind it all, sometimes watching, sometimes funding, are the hidden hands of the United States. Now we travel to Central America to expose one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the rise of death squads in El Salvador and Nicaragua and the foreign powers that fueled them. To understand the bloodshed, we must go back to a region torn apart by inequality, colonial legacies, and Cold War paranoia. By the 1980s, both Nicaragua and El Salvador had plunged into brutal civil wars. In Nicaragua, a revolution had just taken place. The Sandinista Front, a socialist movement, had overthrown the U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship in 1979. Their victory sent shockwaves through Washington. A leftist government just miles from U.S. shores, that was unacceptable. The response came swiftly. The United States armed, trained, and funded a counter-revolutionary force known as the Contras. In El Salvador, the government faced a popular insurgency from the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front FMLN. The U.S. feared another Nicaragua, so it poured in billions of dollars in aid supporting a regime that would soon unleash one of the most horrifying tools of modern repression, death squads. The term sounds clinical, but what it describes is anything but. These were paramilitary groups, often connected to national armies and intelligence services. They operated in the shadows, masking state terror with deniability. In El Salvador, units like the Atlacatl Battalion became infamous. They didn't just target armed rebels. They disappeared students, union leaders, teachers, journalists, priests. Anyone suspected of sympathizing with the left. Entire villages were massacred. Bodies were dumped in rivers and fields. The goal wasn't victory, it was fear. U.S. involvement was not limited to money. American advisors trained officers. American weapons were used. And American silence enabled the rest. Even after the El Mozo massacre, where nearly 1,000 civilians, mostly women and children, were killed, the aid continued. While El Salvador burned, Nicaragua bled. The Sandinista government, originally hailed as liberators, soon embraced authoritarianism. Political opponents were jailed, press freedom was curtailed, and state-sponsored militias began to mirror the brutality they had once opposed. But it was the Contras, funded and armed by the Reagan administration, who unleashed systematic terror. They burned villages, executed civilians, and deliberately targeted healthcare workers, teachers, and aid convoys. The goal: destabilization. The victims: ordinary people caught in the crossfire of empire. When Congress tried to block Contra funding, the Reagan White House found a workaround, selling weapons to Iran, then funneling the profits to the Contras. A scandal that became known as Iran-Contra. By the 1990s, peace accords were signed. The guns fell silent, but the trauma remained. Today, El Salvador still wrestles with the ghosts of its past. Many of the generals who oversaw death squads never faced trial. A 1993 amnesty law protected war criminals for decades, only recently overturned. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas returned to power under Daniel Ortega. Once a revolutionary, now widely condemned as a dictator, the cycle has come full circle. Ortega has crushed dissent, rigged elections, and jailed political opponents. In the name of revolution, he has rebuilt a system of repression. Across both countries, a generation of survivors continues to fight. For recognition, for justice, for memory. Mass graves are still being uncovered, names are still being identified. And families still wait for truth and for closure. Human rights organizations are calling for accountability. not only for those who committed the crimes, but for those who enabled them from afar. What happened in El Salvador and Nicaragua wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a strategy, a deliberate use of terror to reshape nations no matter the cost. Over 200,000 lives were lost across both countries and countless more were shattered. This chapter of history is not over. Its echoes are heard today, in corruption, in fear, and in the fragile democracies that struggle to rise from the rubble. In the 1980s, Latin America didn't only fall to bombs or bullets. It fell to balance sheets, interest rates, and signed contracts. This is the story of economic sabotage. A war waged not by soldiers, but by bankers, economists, and powerful institutions. The 1980s began with promise. Many Latin American nations were growing, investing, building futures. But underneath that optimism loomed a storm. A mountain of debt, a rising tide of inflation, and a system rigged to benefit the few at the expense of the many. As global interest rates soared and export markets crashed, entire economies began to buckle. And when the collapse came, the IMF was waiting. The International Monetary Fund, originally designed to promote global stability, took on a new identity during the Cold War. It became an enforcer not of peace, but of policy. When nations came begging for emergency loans, the IMF offered lifelines with strings attached. Austerity, privatization, deregulation, these were the new commandments of economic survival. But what did they mean in practice? Slashed health budgets, closed schools, laid off public workers, and skyrocketing poverty. Under the banner of stability, millions were pushed into desperation. Behind the IMF's prescriptions lay an ideology, neoliberalism. Born in the think tanks of Chicago and championed in Washington and London, it believed in free markets, small government, and the power of the private sector. With U.S. backing, the IMF pushed structural adjustment programs across the global South. State industries were sold often for pennies. Foreign corporations gained unprecedented access, and national sovereignty was quietly eroded. Local farmers lost land, workers lost jobs, and nations lost control. To many, this wasn't reform, it was economic colonization by another name. By the early 1980s, the dam broke. Mexico was the first to fall, declaring it could no longer service its debt. Then Brazil, Argentina, and others followed. Decades of borrowing encouraged by U.S. banks had turned into a trap, one they couldn't escape. The IMF stepped in again, this time as creditor and rule-maker. Nations were told, you must cut more, sell more, suffer more, but the result wasn't recovery. It was a spiral of loans, payments, and deeper dependence. While economists debated theories in conference rooms, families went hungry, hospitals ran out of supplies. Schools closed, inflation devoured savings. Unemployment soared, and anger rose with it. Protesters filled the streets demanding bread, medicine, and justice. Entire generations came of age in the shadow of imposed poverty. For the poor, austerity meant more than sacrifice. It meant survival day by day, dollar by dollar. As the crisis deepened, so did resistance. Grassroots movements formed. Economists began to question the neoliberal gospel. Former allies of the IMF turned critics. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a political shift had begun. In countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, voters rejected IMF-backed regimes. They elected leaders who promised a new path, one rooted in sovereignty and social justice. Some found limited success, others slid into new forms of authoritarianism. But the message was clear: the people had not forgotten. Today, the scars of economic sabotage are still visible. In crumbling infrastructure, in broken trust, in policies still shaped by fear of foreign lenders. We must ask, who benefits when an entire continent is told to sell off its future? Who writes the rules of the global economy and for whose gain, and perhaps most importantly, what does development really mean if it leaves the majority of people behind? The debt crisis of the 1980s was not just a financial event. It was a human tragedy engineered, enabled, and exploited. What happens when democracy breaks down? When trust is lost, institutions crumble, and millions are forced to flee. In this final chapter, we explore the aftershocks of foreign interference and how it fuels today's most urgent crises: migration, inequality, instability, and global resentment. In the 21st century, we have seen the rise and fall of countless democracies. From Latin America to the Middle East, nations once full of hope are now grappling with authoritarianism, chaos, and division. When democracy fails, it doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes slowly, through corruption, through foreign interference, through disillusionment. As nations descend into instability, their citizens face a stark choice: stay and risk persecution, or flee and face the unknown. By the 2010s, a global migration crisis had emerged, driven not only by war but by economic despair and political collapse. Countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela, and Syria saw millions leave their homelands seeking safety, dignity, and opportunity. But for many, the journey brought only more suffering. Narrator VO: as migrants arrive, host countries often struggle to cope. Public services are stretched, tensions rise, and far-right populism gains ground. Many locals, facing their own economic insecurities, grow resentful, fueling xenophobia and social division. What started as a humanitarian crisis becomes a political one. The United States, long seen as a global champion of democracy, is now at the center of growing resentment. Why? Because many trace the roots of their suffering to decades of U.S. actions backing dictators, toppling governments, imposing economic agendas, destabilizing entire regions. The contradiction is clear. While preaching democracy, the U.S. has often undermined it abroad. As U.S. influence declines, many nations are turning elsewhere. To China, to Russia, to regional alliances not tied to Washington's vision. Trust in the West is fading. A new world order is emerging, one shaped not by ideals but by pragmatism and power. But all is not lost. Around the world, people are rising, demanding dignity, fighting for fairness, rebuilding trust. True democracy begins not with foreign aid or intervention but with community, accountability, and shared purpose. The future depends on what we learn from the past, because if we ignore the wounds we've caused, we'll repeat the pain again. The U.S. left its fingerprints on an entire continent, not only through war and power but through debt, division, and distrust. Today, the legacy of those actions fuels migration, feeds resentment, and fractures fragile democracies. But this story isn't just about the past. It's about how we move forward, about remembering the cost of empire, and about listening to the voices that were once silenced. Because only by understanding what was done can we begin to undo its consequences. Thank you for watching Shadow of Empires. Subscribe if you want more untold truths. Until next time.